we need to understand about manuscripts. Let me tell you a brief story. Let's say that my great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother made some kickin' chocolate chip cookies. I mean, excellent. And she had a secret recipe for them, and she wrote down this secret recipe. And we want to eat those chocolate chip cookies, but as the years have gone by, we've lost that recipe. It got destroyed. Well, how can we find out what she really wrote? Fortunately, there were enough people that really liked this recipe that they made copies, hand copies, no photocopiers, no computers, no fax machines or scanners. So they made handwritten copies of her ingredients, her recipe. So we have those copies, but how can we know that those copies actually reflect what she wrote? Maybe somebody put in 2 teaspoons when they should have put 2 tablespoons. Maybe they made an error in the copying. Or maybe they put in their own ingredients for their cookies that they like better. How can we tell? This is the dilemma we have with ancient manuscripts. Not one ancient manuscript, not Plato's Republic, not Caesar's commentaries on the war, not Homer's Iliad, and not the New Testament. Not one of the ancient manuscripts can we find in the original writing. None of them exist. They don't last that long. They disintegrate. But what we can find is copies, just like my grandmother's cookie recipe. But think about this. What if there were only 2 copies made of my grandmother's cookie recipe? And what if one of them said 2 tablespoons of sugar and the other said 2 teaspoons? There would be no way to verify which was her recipe. But what if there were 100 copies and 98 of them said 2 tablespoons and 2 of them said 2 teaspoons? We'd be pretty sure of what the original actually said, that the majority of copies were probably right. This is how they verify ancient manuscripts. They look and see how many copies they have, compare them with each other for accuracy. So the more copies, the more reliable the manuscript is. Let me give you an example. One example of an ancient manuscript is Julius Caesar, who wrote out the wars he was involved with. It's called Caesar's Commentaries on the Wars. And most historians believe they're pretty reliable. We have a few copies, they compare the copies together, and they get an idea of what Julius Caesar actually wrote. Well, how many copies do we actually have of Julius Caesar's commentaries? 10. A grand total of 10. 10 copies with which to compare accuracy. Now that's just a little bit below average. That's not the best. So let's give a better example. In fact, let's pick one of the best ones that we know about. Homer's Iliad. Now Homer's Iliad has lots and lots of copies. It was very popular, but it doesn't have this many copies. In fact, Homer's Iliad has a lot more than Caesar's copies, which only had 10. This one has almost a whole ream of paper. In fact, a little bit more, about 640 pages. That's about a ream of paper. You can see the difference between the 10 pieces of paper and the 640. And Homer's Iliad is regarded as one of the absolutely best, most easily verified manuscripts. What about the New Testament? What about the Gospels that tell us of the Lord's resurrection? Well, it's not just one ream, which is 500 sheets, and it's not 2, which is 1,000. In fact, it's not even just this whole case, which is 5,000 copies. It's not just one. In fact, it's more than 4 cases of paper. It's 24,000 copies that we have of those early manuscripts. Of course, another question is not just how many copies are there, but how close to the original were these copies made? If my grandmother's cookie recipe is 100 years old and I find a copy of it that was only made in the last couple of years, I know that that copy was made from a copy, which was made from a copy, which was made from a copy, and so on. And I know that the chance of errors having crept in as people made these handwritten copies is pretty large. So the farther away from the original source a copy is, the less reliable we tend to see it. So the closer we can get to the original, the better off we are.
If I started walking from here and every step I took were the equivalent of 1 year's real time,
Elvis would not even have left the building by the time we reached the earliest New Testament copies. See, the truth is, in some cases in the New Testament, some of the copies that we have are within 30 to 100 years of the original manuscripts. 30 to 100 years. That means at the time then, we have copies of some of the people were still alive. But compare that 100 years to the other ancient manuscripts we know about. In fact, take a look at this recording I made the other day, comparing the length it would take me to walk from where I started on that stage to reach some other prominent ancient manuscripts.
So Caesar wrote his commentaries about the same time as the New Testament. But the first copy we have, the earliest copy we have, is 900 years from the original writings. That's where I am now. Each step is 1 year. I am 900 years from our starting place. Let's see how far we are from the school now. And that's one of the good ones. Let's try one that's still pretty reliable, but not as good. I'll meet you over here. Can we trust the things that Plato wrote, that the copies we have are pretty close to what he wrote? You know, most people would say yes. Philosophers, people who study philosophy would say that the copies we have of Plato's writings are probably really close to what he actually wrote. And yet the earliest copies we have are 1,300 years, 1,300 years after the time that Plato is believed to have written them. That's a long way, and that's still not the worst. We can go up another 100 years. We'll finally get to Aristotle. Let's take a look back at the school. Let's see how far we finally come. That is really, really far. Come on.